Hello, and welcome to Adventures in Learning Design, a series of conversations about ideas, principles, research and practice, exploring how we can make learning more effective and more enjoyable, whether that's in the workplace, at school, at university or at home. My name's Laurie Harrison.
And my name's Tim Gifford.
And we're both co-founders of LearnJam, a digital learning agency and consultancy. Episode 4, Design Thinking. In this episode, we talk about design thinking, what it is, how it works, and how we use it in our own projects.
We talk about how we applied it to develop a prototype of a chatbot that the world wasn't ready for.
And we talk about how Tim had to go back to school in order to learn empathy.
Ouch. And we also talked about how mirrors can solve the problem of slow elevators.
And before we jump in, just to let you know, we've got links to some of the resources and articles that we mention in this episode in the podcast description below. Tim, today we're going to be talking about design thinking.
We are.
This is something we've used and I think talked about quite often in our work over the last few years. It's a concept and an approach that we've enjoyed working with and found really helpful in a lot of our learning projects and course development projects. Definitely, and it's getting a lot more traction now, isn't it, in the learning and learning design sphere. So it's interesting to see that, it's serving a lot of different organisations in lots of different ways. But Laurie, question for you, starter for 10. What is design thinking? How would you define it? I would say that design thinking is a process that you work through in order to identify and develop the most appropriate design for a product or service that's based on an understanding of its users and their problems. I don't know how close that is to any official or validated definition, but that's my off the top of my head definition.
Should we ask Google what Google says? I'm actually asking Wikipedia. Design thinking refers to the cognitive, strategic and practical processes by which design concepts, maybe proposals for new products, buildings or machines, etc., are developed. Many of the concepts and aspects of design thinking have been identified through studies across different design domains of design cognition and design activity in laboratory and natural contexts. So a practical process by which design concepts are developed. Laurie?
That sounds pretty similar to what I said, I think, doesn't it?
So I think your answer is a good one.
It's a process for coming up with a concept which is grounded in who your users are and what problems they have, or what needs they have that you can fill. I think another aspect of it, though, is around innovation. I think there is inherent in the process and the principles of design thinking a drive to be creative, come up with creative solutions, or to challenge assumptions, or to reframe problems and think about things in a different way. I think that's what I've always found very attractive about design thinking as an approach. So it's not just a kind of cookie cutter, work through these steps and you will always get this result. It's here's a framework and a process to enable you to come up with a solution that you wouldn't have done otherwise. I think that's where the real value can come.
Yeah, kind of forcing you through this design thinking process to go beyond your first idea. Yeah. An idea that you are kind of coming into the room with and getting you to think beyond that and kind of extend yourself in that way. And I like to hark back to when we talked about learning design in episode 1 and we kind of unpacked those two terms, like the design aspect of that we articulated in the words of Stephen Dean, which is a view that I do subscribe to, where he said, design is the practice of looking at what can be improved in the world and improving upon it. Yeah. And I think design thinking process is a really creative, collaborative, exploratory way of working through ideas and potential solutions that do meet a need or a problem that you've identified. So question 2, Laurie, if I may, why is this an important practice in learning design? What does it serve in that domain?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to come back to what I said a moment ago, which I think is around challenging assumptions or coming up with fresh approaches, or as you said, like not just doing the first thing that comes to mind. And I think for me, that's an important aspect of learning design, which is that in the field of learning, there are a lot of assumptions or fossilized ways of working and ways of doing things. And I like the fact that design thinking forces you to break out of that cycle sometimes, and also that it's, I think, inherently leads to a more learner-centered way of designing learning experiences or learning products, because design thinking is so grounded in understanding with and empathizing with the user of the product, which in our case would be a learning experience of some kind. So that learner-centeredness, I think that's a real benefit of applying the design thinking process. And also, I just like having a framework and a process that you can follow, that works. Rather than come up with a process on the hoof every time you do a piece of work, which is not a great way to do things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It kind of gives that a nice structure and a format and a framework for kind of working with fairly unstructured, inchoate ideas, right? What I love about the design thinking process in the work that we do is it's a really great way of like injecting creativity and like moving people outside of or beyond like their normal way of operating. Like you were saying, sort of like it's very easy to make assumptions and to kind of go into a product development conversation burdened with what's worked well in the past. Yeah. And it's always great to go into a learning-oriented organization and kind of have a really creative conversation with publishing managers, publishing directors, or like product managers, like see a shift in the room. And I think a really happy byproduct of this process is just a team working together in a different way. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah, and people getting really engaged with these sort of conversations around ideas and what ifs. I think is always really inspiring. And even if they don't go anywhere particularly, it's just a really invigorating conversation to have.
Yeah, I agree, and I've seen that happen. But I think it's a combination of that and the fact that it's a practical process that is not just let's all get in a room and daydream. The goal is we will develop a product concept, we will test it with real learners, we will learn from that. And in doing that, we will be in a better position to serve learners better or to be commercially successful if we're trying to develop a product or whatever. It's the combination of the two things, isn't it? It's the kind of creative vibe combined with there's a practical purpose here, and this gives you a framework for achieving something.
If I may, outcome-oriented daydreaming. I'm just going to cut straight to the truth of this. TM.
I love it.
So, Laurie, let's talk about what's involved in the design thinking process. What are the stages that you typically go through?
Okay, so the main stages are you start by understanding the user deeply. So who are they? What are their motivations? What do we know about them? And go through a process of really learning who they are, what makes them tick, and empathizing with them. Then you move on to understanding or framing the problem that user has that you're looking to solve. So there's a phase of and a whole sort of structured series of activities and processes to help you understand the problem or the need. Then you move on to the third stage, which is generating ideas for a possible solution. So you move from understand the user, understand the problem, and then move towards a solution. And the first stage in that is generating ideas. So we would describe this as a divergent thinking stage. Now that we know what makes these users tick and what problem they face that we'd like to solve, what are all the different ways that could possibly solve that problem or meet that need? And this is where the creative firepower comes in. Then you move into a convergent thinking stage where, okay, we've generated loads of cool ideas. Now let's whittle those down to, okay, what do we think is actually the best solution for this problem? So we've moved from understand the user, understand the problem, generate ideas, decide on a solution. Then the final piece is to develop a prototype or a working version or something that you can test. So we've decided what we think the solution should be. Now we need to realize that in some form that we can test with those users and see if it's actually working for them. If they agree that it will solve that problem. And then from that test with real users, we then analyze the results of that and either decide, yep, we've really hit the mark here, now we can throw resources at this and develop a solution, or we need to cycle back and maybe go through some or all of those steps again to rework our proposed solution, and keep doing that basically until we hit a point of validation where the users are giving us validation that our solution is something that's going to work for them, that it's worth us spending time, money, effort in developing a full solution. So that's my interpretation or my rundown of what the key stages are in the process.
And critically, it's looking to, as well as providing a framework, like a practical framework for arriving at a value-delivering solution, it's also, I think, a really useful and effective way of avoiding waste and like accruing risk. And this is something that we have seen quite a lot in our experiences, right? Where there's an opportunity or a market need for a particular product, and you use your past experiences and what's worked well in other courses and with other audiences, and you kind of build to that. But in doing that, you are kind of accruing tons of risk because you haven't validated anything. You haven't necessarily got a sense of, is this solving the right problem? Is it solving a problem at all? So this design thinking process really helps not just come up with creative ideas, but actually pin those ideas to a known, understood problem, right? And to work quickly at iterating towards something that is going to solve that.
Exactly, yeah. So I guess it's kind of like going back to first principles a bit rather than working off the back of assumptions.
Yeah.
We've seen in a lot of cases large investments of time and money and energy going into products or learning solutions based on assumptions or previous experience or what worked before, without going back to first principles and, okay, let's understand who the learners are, what makes them tick. Are we clear on what problem we're trying to solve, what outcome we want to get them to? What are all the different ways that we could do that? Which of those ways seems like the most likely to work? Do they agree? When we present them that solution in some early prototype form, do they agree that it's going to solve that problem for them?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a kind of big element of, this is a process that helps you feel more confident in what you're doing at the point that you need to invest heavily in creating something. So this is a risk reduction thing, as well as a way of fostering creativity. I think it serves both of those purposes. And I think this is why this approach is often associated with agile and lean project approaches, the lean startup approach, which is kind of coming from the same place. Let's work iteratively and incrementally and learn rather than make a big bet based on assumptions or hearsay or what the most highly paid person wants or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that kind of like fail quickly, fail often thing, isn't it? It's like the more we fail in this, the more sort of assumptions we can dismiss or validate. And the quicker we do that, the better we move towards a solution that is going to be successful and deliver value. So going back to the top of your breakdown there, so we've got key stages: understanding the learner and their problem, generating ideas to respond to that, and then prototyping and testing solutions to kind of iterate towards something that does demonstrably work. In the understanding the learner and the problem, there are a few things we do in that space, right, that we have done historically that are quite useful. So one thing is to really understand a learner. Something we've done in the past is like observation. And I was thinking back to, this happened a few years ago now, but one of the first projects we worked on was for an international school, an international language school, and they wanted some assistance sort of devising a sort of digital learning proposition for their students. And something that I did was spend a week in that school, almost undercover. But like, we saw real value in, I really want to understand what it's like to be a student in your environment, in your school environment. Like what is it like to go through the onboarding, to kind of be orientated into the school, to attend lessons, to have a schedule? What does that feel like? And in doing so, getting a sense of what was already happening. What's the starting point here? And that was really, really useful and really informed a lot of what we did thereafter.
I think you get stuff from that you won't get through just talking to, in that case, the school manager, for example. What problems do people face, when they're starting a course or as part of the onboarding process? I think actually seeing that and experiencing that.
Yeah.
You learn different things, don't you? And I think critically for you, Tim, the other thing is that, through spending a week at that language school, you improved your English.
I mean, yeah, listen to me now.
Quite significantly. So,
I mean, I was really struggling before.
Yeah.
But actually, side note, it was quite embarrassing, tricky because I don't think I did a good enough job at the time of letting all the staff know that I was undercover and to not come at me in class with some questions or ask me to sort of produce anything. So I can't really. I'm going to have to say something and blow it. That was a really useful thing, and definitely would advocate any opportunity you've got to get under the skin of the learners that you're kind of designing for is really, really useful. So that's a really interesting thing. And also, something else we do to move us towards a better understanding of learners, other than observation, is interviews or questioning. Mm-hmm. And we have used something called powerful questions that really help us do that. And the idea behind powerful questions is that they unearth different aspects or dimensions of a learner's current experience, of their aspirations and that sort of stuff. And they are intended to move beyond, do you like X, or what do you want more of, what do you want less of, and kind of move towards what's their emotional state. Why are they doing what they're doing? What do they want to get out of this, and all that sort of stuff? And
so it's kind of deeper motivations and trying to find deeper insights, because there's a classic sort of thing in product development, which is, I think it's a Steve Jobs quote, isn't it? Something along the lines of, you can't ask people what they want. That's not a good way of designing a product, because people don't know what they want until they see something.
Yeah.
And respond to it. And I think the idea of powerful questions is, you don't just ask a learner, well, what do you want? That doesn't really give you any. It might give you something, but it doesn't give you any real insights. And these are kind of questions designed to dig a bit deeper. What makes people tick? What's important to them? What do they worry about? What makes them stressed? What makes them interested? What fires them up? What are their motivations, and so on. And I think we found this a really valuable tool, I think, to help us do that, and a fairly simple concept, actually. I mean, it is basically a list of questions that we have up our sleeves, when we're talking to learners, that help us do that. Tim, you got any examples of some of the powerful questions that we've used that have worked well?
Yeah, sure. So we've got a few that we captured in the document here, and it's teed up with wonderful quote by Erica Hall from Just Enough Research. The first rule of user research: never ask anyone what they want.
Oh, that's what I just said.
That's pretty much what you just said, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think I attributed it to Steve Jobs, but
I
think he did say something along those lines.
I'm sure he's used those words in some order at some point. So we've got a list of questions here, and they kind of split across three different aspects, like I say. So questions to do with motivations and desired outcomes, questions that explore context and behaviors, and questions that explore feelings and emotions. So an example of one around motivations and desired outcomes would be, what are you trying to accomplish in life that you think this particular skill or knowledge would help you with? What does good enough look like for you regards to this skill? What about perfect? So kind of get them thinking about, what is this learning? What am I trying to achieve by learning this skill or attaining this knowledge? Going into context and behaviors, we ask questions like, how are you currently spending your time when you're learning this skill or knowledge at the moment? If you had an extra hour free each day to spend on it, how would you spend it? What factors in your life make learning this skill or knowledge more of a challenge? And what factors make it less of a challenge? So it's those sorts of things. How are you currently doing it, and what context are you in?
You can see from those kind of questions, the answers to those are going to be quite different from what do you want to learn?
What do you want more of? What would you like less of?
Can you actually visualize, what will your life look like if you have acquired this skill or knowledge? What does that mean to you? And I think that kind of stuff's really, really powerful.
Just adds another dimension. And finally, the final sort of category is around feelings and emotions. So, this is super simple, but what kind of things just make you happy as a human being? Which parts of learning the skill or knowledge make you feel joy or happiness? Where do you feel stuck when you're involved in this stuff. What do you feel passionate about? So kind of getting more into the human side of this. Like, how do you feel about your learning or learning this skill? So all of that stuff really helps to enrich, I suppose, the conversations around the ideas that come out in response to that.
Yeah, and I think help you think about the learning experience, which is something we've talked about quite a lot as well. You know, what is a good, effective, enjoyable learning experience going to be like for this learner or this type of learner, which helps you think a little bit beyond just what is the learning outcome.
Yeah.
You know, learning is a process. It's an experience. It's something. You know, it's something that you experience, and if it's going to work and be effective, you know, that has to be a positive, or at least a satisfying in some way experience. Yeah. So questions like, where do you find joy in learning, or what do you find stressful or frustrating? I think that really helps you dig into what the experience needs to be or to provide for that learner.
Yeah.
Which I think is really important.
Absolutely. Another strategy around sort of engaging with learners is the classic 5 whys. Just kind of like starting conversation, asking some questions around what are you currently doing, what's your current approach to solving this problem, for example, or you know what challenges are you experiencing around this, and then kind of drilling down, like peeling layer by layer, just by kind of going back with well, why is that? What is happening when you're doing that, and why is that? It does come across, well, can come across as being quite sort of I don't know, a bit nagging. Sounds like sometimes exactly. Just reminds me of like a toddler does a why every time someone says something, but it's really, really useful, and it kind of helps you to zero in on underlying challenges and problems rather than how they present themselves. I think that's what it's getting at, right? So not just like what's the superficial expression of that problem, but like where has that come from? What is the underlying issue that we maybe need to talk about?
Yeah, there's an example I think that we used in a blog post or something, wasn't it? Someone says, okay, I want to improve my English. Why do you want to improve your English? Because that'll help me get a better job. Why do you want to get a better job? Well, actually, because I want to get my own flat. Why do you want to have your own flat? Because I want to feel independent as an adult. And it's like, okay, that's quite interesting. That's the deeper motivation and the sort of emotional hit there. That's not necessarily something that will guide directly how you design a course, but it could do. It could have an influence on what you do in terms of what that learning experience needs to be like. Okay, this is the underlying motivation here. This is about independence and moving into adulthood. That's what we're trying to achieve with this.
Definitely.
Rather than this person needs to increase their English language level from this level to that level.
Succeed at a job interview, for example.
Yeah.
It really helps build empathy as well. We get a kind of a persona coming through of somebody who values independence, and are willing and eager to work towards that. It's a really good point. So that's like sort of understanding learners or understanding users. What about understanding the problem that they're facing? I mean, we've kind of used 5 whys to kind of get a better sense of what is the underlying problem. But there's a couple of things we do or can be done around like getting a better picture of what the problem that needs to be solved is. So one thing that is really useful in this conversation, in this part of the process, is problem reframing. And this is a way of kind of interrogating whether you are actually solving like the right problem, so that the solutions that you then go on to develop are actually aimed at the right problem space.
Yeah.
So a really good example of this, and I'm going to totally put my hands up and say this is just borrowing heavily directly from somebody else's effort, but a really good example here is put forward by Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg in an article on the Harvard Business Review back in 2017. And Thomas gives a really good example of problem reframing through the story of the slow elevator problem. Have you heard of this one? Yeah. This may be familiar to you.
I think I have, Tim, yeah.
Let me spin through it. But the problem scenario is, an office building that has several elevators operating in it, or lifts, and clients, employees, people who use these complain of them being too slow. So there's a problem of elevators in the building are too slow. So obviously the first response to that is, well, let's tinker with the pulleys, the system, to or install faster, more modern elevators to solve that problem. And what Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg suggests is, there's another way of looking at that. I interrogate that problem from a different perspective, rather than it being a framing around slow elevators. Maybe it's worth looking at But the problem here maybe is that people are getting annoyed and impatient and bored with waiting for these elevators. So reframe that as this wait is boring problem, which then leads to another set of potential solutions around, well, what can we do to make that waiting time feel more interesting, less boring, make it feel shorter? And that leads to the solutions like, as he puts it forward in his article, things like putting mirrors on the doors of the elevators so that you've got something to look at. You can look at yourself, you can look at other people.
No one gets bored looking at themselves, do they? So,
happy to spend minutes looking in elevator door mirrors, or like add music, or like something else, something that distracts you from the fact that you're just sat there waiting. And also, maybe there's something around, maybe the problem could be identified as something else, like there's too high demand for these elevators at any given time. So maybe there's some solutions around staggering when people have their lunch breaks, so they're not overburdening the elevator system. But all of this is to say that when interrogating the problem, kind of take time to explore, I suppose, other ways of looking at it, to discover or expose solutions that may be more feasible, easier, more achievable, and like have a direct correlation to our problem rather than sort of a broader one.
Yeah. I think it's a really good principle, and I think actually there's a very direct application of this to learning and learning design here, which is that in a lot of situations, an identified problem within an organisation or a business may not be solved by a learning solution. And as someone who makes a living from designing learning solutions, that might sound a bit odd to kind of push that agenda. But I think this way of reframing problems applies here because certainly in a lot of organisational situations, it might be the case that there is a perceived performance issue, for example. This thing isn't being done as well as it needs to be in our organisation. And a lot of times there's an assumption that, okay, we need to train people to do this thing better. And I think this sort of reframing approach can help you sort of dig a little bit deeper into that. It's like, okay, what's going on here? What is the real problem here? What's the underlying cause of that problem? Is it that people don't know how to do this thing well and that therefore training is an appropriate solution? Or is there something else that's causing this thing not to be done well? Is it that, I don't know, there's a process problem within the organisation that could easily be solved? Is it that just there's some information that isn't available? If it was easily available, suddenly people would be able to do this thing well. So it's the same concept and principle. It's not necessarily that a learning solution is always the best answer to a problem, and that by interrogating what the real problem is and digging a bit deeper, you may uncover a different solution, which is where this elevator analogy works really well. Replacing all the lifts in an office building with faster ones is a massive and expensive project, but sticking some mirrors in them may solve the underlying problem just as effectively for a tiny fraction of the cost and time. And it may be that tweaking a process or providing a bit of a job aid or a bit of information that people need in order to carry out a particular task or process effectively, that may solve the problem better than designing and building a learning solution and putting everyone through a course.
I think we've had conversations, haven't we? Certainly design sprints where the outcome has been, this isn't a learning solution. This isn't something that we can help you with. This is something else. It's something organizational, something more process orientated than learning, which is a good outcome. I mean, it is. It's the right outcome. And having that process in place to get to that point is, going to ultimately help the client do what they need to do. Understanding learners and understanding the problem. But by the end of that point, you've got a clear problem statement. You know what the problem is you're trying to solve. Whether or not you've reframed it, whether that's been necessary or helpful, but we've got a clear sense of we're trying to solve this problem for these set of people, this audience. You then go into what the next step you said was generating ideas. What's a good way of generating ideas? How do we get that kicked off?
I mean, there are lots of ways to do that. There's a couple of things that we commonly do as part of our process that we find work really well. And actually the first thing is seeking inspiration from a wide variety of sources. So if we know that this is our learner type, learner persona, this is the problem, we've got a clear definition of the problem that we're trying to solve, we really like to go through a process of looking far and wide for inspiration. So what are some products that solve similar kinds of problems in interesting ways? What are some things that we can see in other fields or other areas that maybe nothing to do with learning?
What I really like doing this part of the conversation is like looking outside of the domain, looking at a completely different space, different companies, organizations, completely unrelated to the problem we're solving, and thinking about how they might solve this problem. So, for example, like what would Airbnb do with this particular problem, or like, based on their model, based on their sort of product, services, all that sort of stuff, or how might Virgin Atlantic solve this? And it just kind of like just shifts a little bit, and just kind of by role playing it, you kind of start seeing it from some different dimensions, from different perspectives, and also to start a bit more inspiration, just kind of get some sparks going from what's already.
It works. It's a really nice technique actually. I really like that one. Yeah, what would X organisation that's totally different in a different field, what would they do, and kind of try and imagine that, and that often really sparks interesting ideas. Another one I like, if it's a commercial organisation, is what would your most bitter competitor do?
Oh yeah,
that's always a really nice one.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Or if competitor X was determined to take you out of the market completely, what would they do?
Yeah. Oh yeah,
good one. So it's these sort of thought experiments, isn't it? So it's kind of bringing in and showing and sharing examples of cool stuff, and then using that also to launch thought experiments about what would X organisation or person do if they were tackling this challenge or this problem. Yeah,
always a lot of fun. Yeah, and then from there we tend to fire up the crazy eights, right?
Crazy eights.
So this is a great little activity. So piece of paper, fold it into 8 segments, and unfold it. So you've got a grid of 8 squares, effectively. And the idea is that in 8 minutes, you sketch out 8 ideas, like super, super quick sketches, no attachment to like how they look, how in depth they are, how feasible they are, anything like that. It's just like brain dump. And I love this part of it because this goes back to what we were saying at the top. Like it moves you past your first idea and like pushes you, kind of forces you to respond to the inspiration, or just to kind of just think creatively in the moment and just jot down some other interpretations for how you might solve that problem. And if you've got a group of people around a table doing crazy eights, you've got like dozens and dozens of just like fresh, interesting ideas that you can then start pooling and responding to. But very much, that's part of the divergent thinking part, but really effective. And again, like a lot of fun when you see people like doodling on bits of paper and coming up with varying degrees of wacky idea.
I really love this, and like you said, because of the format, you are forced to go beyond your instant response and your first idea, and I think that's where the value comes. And it might be, you come up with your first idea, you sketch that, you come up with the other 7, they're rubbish. That's fine, but you've explored it. But actually, what tends to happen is there is something of interest in those other bits. Even if you hit a point, and I've done this, of I get 3 or 4 down, and then I just start being stupid and doing stuff because I think it might be funny. But that's where the best ideas come from. And Laurie. Sometimes, you do something that you just to be stupid, and actually that's not bad.
I think you're onto something there. Go back one. It's that one.
So no, I think it's a really nice and a really simple technique. I think we're big fans of simple frameworks and artificial constraints and things like that. Let's use this tool or this framework to guide our thinking, rather than like let's brainstorm.
Yeah. So who's got what ideas?
Who's got some ideas? Just throw some ideas around. That can work, but I think there's real value in providing some structure to the idea generation process. I'm not going to call it ideation, by the way, because I hate that word.
Don't use the word ideation. Imagineering?
Yeah, that's much better. Yeah, that's fine.
I'm sure we can come up with another definition of that we can start launching.
But I think for us today, we've seen the value of that, of sort of providing structures, like the Crazy 8 process, and there's other things as well. But that's one that we've used a lot recently that's worked really well.
And it speaks to something that I think is often overlooked in lots of domains, not just ours, not just our industry or what we do, but I think like in the grown-up world, which is play. Like we don't play enough. And at this stage in design thinking, like you're really invited to, and it's important that you do, like play. And by play, I take that as meaning engaging in an activity that has no you're not attached to what the outcome is. It doesn't necessarily have an outcome. It's just, I'm going to indulge in something creative and fun, almost just for the sake of it, because it's enjoyable and because, it's like that is the end goal, to enjoy it. And I think the more that we do that, the better.
I think switching to kind of play mode sometimes, it's really useful because it dramatically lowers the stakes in what you're doing at that moment, and therefore takes the pressure off and frees you to do stuff you otherwise wouldn't do, because you're not thinking about, oh, well, our budget wouldn't allow us to do this, or, this might not be practical, or my boss wouldn't want this, or whatever. And, 99% of the stuff you come up with won't make it. But that's fine, because the goal is to find the few percent of all the little sparks that otherwise wouldn't come if you are just in sort of completely practical, serious grown-up mode for the whole process.
And that's it. Like the play mode, there are no right or wrong answers. It's just fun, explore, see where it takes you. And I think that's a really, really valuable part of the process. And I want to see more of it in the world, Laurie. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
I think we could all benefit. So Crazy Eights, you've got loads of ideas out on paper, varying degrees of wackiness, varying degrees of feasibility. And then we pull those together, right? Like share and compare.
Yeah.
And just see what that sparks in the room as well. Then it kind of take it a step further and start, okay, let's start sketching out some ideas. Let's take a few of those Crazy Eight ideas, Crazy Eight sort of doodles, and start working them into something a bit more fleshed out. And this is called like the solution sketch, right? So like another bit of paper and start, okay, put some flesh on that idea. What does it look like? What does a learner or user interact with? What are they doing? What are they seeing? How does it work? And just start kind of digging into it a little bit deeper. So you've done the Crazy Eights, you've come up with a load of ideas, and that is really intended to get the juices flowing. And then the next stage, we take it into solution sketches. So you pick an idea that you want to flesh out, and you spend a bit more time kind of working out what's the user or what's the learner doing, what are they interacting with, what does this solution kind of look like in a bit more detail. And it's one that, you want to work up one that you feel attached to, or something that you really want to explore more. But it's just a way of kind of, once you've got your juices flowing, kind of thinking about one particular solution in a bit more detail, right?
Yeah. It's where it sort of starts to come together in your mind, and you express that as a slightly more realised idea, and then you share those. You look at what everyone's come up with, you talk through it, get reactions, and then we start to transition into convergent thinking. So we've sort of diverged, we've generated a load of ideas, we've fleshed those out, but we need to move towards one solution concept that we're then going to prototype and test with our learners. So one way that we often do this is if we've got, let's say, half a dozen solution sketches now that have been presented and shared, I guess a simple and low-tech way of trying to get consensus on where to focus and which ideas are really resonating with the group and feel like the best fit is dot voting.
Love a dot vote.
Obviously, we're doing this remotely these days. In real life, imagine you've got sketches and post-its all over the wall, and everyone is given a load of stickers, dot stickers or circle stickers of different colours, and you might give each person, say, 10 stickers. And the idea is that you look at all of the solution sketches that are on the wall, and you just stick a dot anywhere next to something that you find interesting or you think is really good or impactful. And everyone does that. And then at the end of that process, you've kind of got a heat map almost, haven't you? You can kind of see where there are clusters of dots, which tends to happen. You don't tend to find that they're completely evenly distributed. So there will be a particular sketch or part of a sketch that seems to be attracting a lot of good vibes.
Yeah.
As you can see, and you see the clusters of dots. And from there, or as a team, you can start to sort of home in on, okay, these are the things that collectively we think are really interesting and really speak to that problem nicely. So that's, you're sort of starting to converge. Your ideas are starting to converge in something a bit more coherent. And
you mentioned sort of, that's how we do it in person, but we've managed to kind of replicate that experience in Mural, right? For like remote sessions. Mural is an online sort of whiteboard collaboration tool, basically. A tool to kind of use to create sort of post-its and sort of move ideas around.
Other tools are available, by the way, too.
Cannot stress that enough. Other tools are available, but it has a dot voting feature in it. So you can just do dot votes really quick. That's how we've done that. So you get to a point where you've all starting to converge around a proposed solution, and then into the final stage, which is like starting to work that up into a prototype. What sort of prototypes have you worked on? What forms have they typically taken for you?
Various forms. The end result as a prototype could be something drawn on pieces of paper. That I've seen that done. It could be a working prototype website. It could be something that's been created in some kind of online tool. So there's a tool called Balsamic, which I've used to create wireframe websites, a representation of a website that looks like a hand-drawn sketch, but you can click the links and you can put dummy content in and so on. There's all sorts of ways to do it, and in a way it doesn't really matter, in as much as what matters is this going to be an expression of that solution that is going to make sense to a learner? Is this going to convey that solution effectively? And in some cases that might mean you need something quite slick and high-res looking. And in other cases, it might be fine just to quickly test a hand-drawn series of sketches. Kind of depends what you're trying to test and who you're testing it with. It's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, I guess. But in terms of what I've seen and what I've done, it ranges all the way from sketches through to small-scale, fully working, thin slices of a product.
Yeah, and it's like an exercise in what is the best, quickest way to put something together that tests whether we are solving that problem in the way that we anticipated. I think something that really comes through in this when we're doing this is, the expectation on the client side that these have to be like quite high res, really well designed, really quite sophisticated things. Like a prototype equals product when it doesn't. Prototype equals like an expression of this idea in a way that someone can interact with, and we can learn whether or not we are delivering value in the way we thought. I've used things like Google Slides for prototyping like a digital course, a digital experience, and just using sort of clickable areas of those slides to show how a learner would move through. And I've used bits of paper just to sketch out screens, sketch out flows. That's worked really well. I mean, we've used WhatsApp for prototyping.
That's true. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I did.
Can we deliver value in this conversational way?
That's a really great example, that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
That was a product idea we developed. It was a few years ago now, actually, but it was for a chatbot interface, wasn't it? For a product to help Spanish speakers who are learning English answer their questions or help them with issues that they've got with English. And it was called Ask Me English. And the product concept was a chatbot. And we worked through this design thinking process that we've described to come up with that. We spoke to learners and we understood what their problems were and generated loads of ideas, and we came up with solution sketches. The solution that we arrived at was a chatbot interface where you install an app and then you ask a question and you get some kind of AI generated response, basically. It might be a question about grammar, for example, and it would tell you, okay, this is what you should be saying in this situation. But the prototype that we created was a WhatsApp number. It was a phone number.
We don't need to build a conversational interface. One exists.
Exactly.
And we've got AI. We've got I. So we can use that.
Yeah, and we had a real person pretending to be the bot. Answering questions in WhatsApp, and it enabled us to test the concept with real learners in a realistic way. We didn't need to spend money building a product.
Ultimately testing, does a learner see value in asking a question about English, getting a response back in a text message, and would they see value in that enough to continue doing it?
Yeah,
and they did.
For the record, the answer was they saw value in it, but they weren't prepared to pay for it. So we didn't spend time and money developing the product.
And that's a whole other conversation, isn't it? Value versus monetization. Yeah.
So those are the stages that we go through in the design thinking process. And just to wrap this up, let's just recap what those are. So we start with understanding the learner as deeply as we can, trying to build, a knowledge of who they are, what makes them tick, what their motivations are.
We talked about using the 5 whys in powerful questions to do that. And I might pop a link to those at the bottom of this podcast so you can get your hands on those.
That's a good idea, Tim. Yeah. Okay. So once we understand the learner and what makes them tick, we then look to dig into the problem or problems that the learner has that we're seeking to solve. So is there a real problem here? What is it? And looking at that from different angles, maybe reframing that and seeing if there's maybe a deeper or a different problem than we may first have assumed. So that's a kind of really an interesting part of the process, I think, because a lot of the whole value of design thinking for us is about breaking out of fixed ways of thinking or challenging assumptions. And often actually, if you try to solve the wrong problem, however well you solve it, you're not really going to succeed. So we need to make sure that we are tackling the right problem.
Sometimes that's putting a mirror on an elevator door rather than getting a faster elevator.
That's very well put, Tim. That's a good analogy here. So Once we've done that, we then move into generating ideas and moving towards a solution. So we go through a divergent thinking process, bringing in inspiration, using things like crazy eights to generate crazy ideas, or even just good ideas. Get the creative juices flowing, come up with lots of ideas, and then go through a process of refining and whittling those down until we arrive at what we think is the best solution to the problem that we identified. And then we look to prototype that in as lean a way as possible, which may just be sketches on paper, maybe a fully working but small-scale website or app, maybe somewhere in between. And then we test that with real learners and learn from that. So from the results of that testing, have we hit upon something here? Have we got a solution that is working for these people? Or do we need to go back through some of those stages, some or all of those stages again, and rework and iterate what we're doing until we get validation that we've got it right, at which point we can then more confidently proceed to developing a full product or solution.
Bang on. And I think, the reason we're talking about this and its relationship to learning design is that we see it's that sort of design thinking practice. When you combine that with an understanding of what makes effective learning, like you're kind of bringing like learning design thinking into it.
Yeah.
So it's all of what we've just discussed above, plus adding into the mix at every stage of that, or specifically when you're going into sort of solution and sort of prototyping, what is the learning principle? What are the learning principles that I'm bringing into play here? So it's kind of design thinking with that learning lens applied to it.
Yeah, for us, that's where it gets really interesting, actually. And that's what we try to do as far as we can, apply that way of thinking and that process for coming up with creative solutions to problems that are grounded in real people and what they need to do. And then, as you said, applying that understanding of learning and what works in learning and filtering everything through that to create something that a learning solution or a learning experience that is more likely to hit the mark and to succeed for learners.
Hey, dude, it's not just what we do, it's who we are, Laurie. Let's face
That's
it.
a good point, yeah.
Down to our bones.
Yes. I think design thinking combined with learning and learning design, it's a big topic. And I think we've scratched the surface of it really in this episode, to be honest. I think there's a lot more to explore. There are all sorts of different aspects of it, things to bear in mind, different tools and techniques. We shared a couple today in this conversation, which we hope you'll find useful. But there's a lot more to it. And I'm really interested in going a lot deeper into this over maybe a few more episodes in the future, And we're really keen to bring in people with specific areas of expertise, that go beyond what we know. Really interested to explore this with them. Let's talk to people who are real experts and practitioners in design thinking, but maybe not from a learning background. Let's talk to other people with learning design and learning expertise and who are maybe not so familiar with this way of working and kind of see what happens.
You know what? I'm going to go as far to put an appeal out on this episode. Like if you're working in learning design and you've got a view or experiences to share on how you've applied design thinking in your practice, reach out. Be great to have a chat. Be great to get your voice on this. Or if you're not from a learning design background but are very well acquainted with like design thinking and have something really something to share that kind of helps us as learning designers, or could help us as learning designers evolve our practice, we'd love to hear from you as well. Let's bring some more voices to this conversation to find out more about how we can use that to enrich what we do.
Yeah, please do. There are many ways you can contact us. You can email us on hello@learnjam.com. Might be the easiest one, and we'll probably put some others up online as well.
Absolutely. Find us on LinkedIn, come to our website, learnjam.com, and hit contact us. But we'd love to hear from you. Yeah, let's get some more voices on this, Laurie. Not that I don't like talking to you. You are like scintillating conversation.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. We both have lovely voices, but let's get some more.
To some other lovely voices on. That's all we're saying.
Adventures in Learning Design was brought to you by LearnJam.
To learn more about what we do and who we do it for, and to download your own free copy of our learning design principles, head over to learnjam.com.